For most of the last 50 years, one ingredient has carried the blame for headaches, allergies, and what people used to call Chinese restaurant syndrome, despite that entire theory falling apart the moment researchers actually sat down and tested it under controlled conditions. Monosodium glutamate is simply the sodium salt of glutamic acid, an amino acid your own body produces constantly and that occurs naturally in tomatoes, Parmesan cheese, and mushrooms. Chinese kitchens have used it with real precision for generations, long before Western supermarkets ever stocked a single jar of it. Here are 31 clever MSG secrets that will change how you cook, how you season, and even how you garden. And the very last one is the trick that professional Chinese kitchens guard the closest, the one most home cooks never learn. 31. The soup base fix. Add a quarter teaspoon of MSG to a pot of stock right before serving, never while it's still simmering away on the stove. Glutamate binds to specific receptors on your tongue called umami receptors, and those receptors amplify whatever meat, bone, or mushroom flavor is already present in the broth, rather than introducing a new taste of its own. Cantonese soup stalls have relied on this exact late-stage timing trick for decades, because adding it too early lets some of the aroma cook off before the bowl ever reaches the customer. 30. Fried rice that actually tastes like the restaurant version. Sprinkle 1/8 of a teaspoon over your rice in the final 30 seconds of frying, right as you're tossing it in the wok. Restaurant kitchens use commercial burners that hit temperatures far beyond what a home stove can reach, and that extra heat naturally develops deeper savory compounds through browning. MSG closes that heat gap by intensifying the umami notes your home stove simply can't produce on its own, no matter how long you cook the rice. 29. Marinade for tougher cuts of meat. Mix half a teaspoon of MSG into your soy sauce and cornstarch marinade for beef or pork shoulder. It won't physically break down muscle fibers the way baking soda or papaya enzymes do, but it saturates the meat with glutamate at a cellular level, so every single bite tastes richer even when you're working with a cheaper, tougher cut that would otherwise taste flat. Let it sit for at least 20 minutes before cooking for the flavor to fully penetrate. 28. Cutting salt without losing flavor. In almost any savory dish, replace a quarter of your usual salt measurement with an equal amount of MSG. Sodium content drops by roughly 30%, while the perceived saltiness barely changes at all, because glutamate triggers an entirely separate taste pathway on the tongue that reads as depth and richness rather than pure salinity. This is one of the few substitutions that dietitians actually endorse, because it doesn't leave food tasting punished the way most low-sodium swaps do. 27. Reviving bland canned soup. A small pinch, stirred into canned or boxed broth, wakes up flavors that were flattened during industrial processing and months of shelf storage. Chinese households that keep canned goods on hand for emergencies or busy weeks use this trick to make shelf-stable soup taste like it was made fresh that morning, rather than something poured straight from a tin. 26. Stir-fried vegetables with more punch. Toss in a small pinch, no more than 1/8 of a teaspoon, into your vegetables during the very last minute of stir-frying. Vegetables like bok choy, cabbage, and mushrooms already carry natural glutamates on their own, and this trick simply pushes that existing savoriness past the threshold, where your tongue actually registers it as flavor instead of just background taste. 25. Tofu that tastes like it marinated for hours. Dust plain steamed or pan-fried tofu with a tiny amount of MSG right before serving, rather than trying to marinate it in advance. Tofu is famously good at absorbing flavor slowly, but terrible at generating any on its own, and this shortcut compresses what would normally take hours of soaking into a few seconds of seasoning at the very end. 24. Instant noodles, worth actually eating. Add 1/8 teaspoon to your instant ramen or rice noodles alongside the seasoning packet that comes in the package. Most packaged noodle seasonings already contain small amounts of MSG, and topping that up brings out the umami depth that manufacturers deliberately dilute to keep production costs down across mass-produced noodle brands. 23. Popcorn that tastes like the movie theater version. Mix a small pinch into melted butter before tossing it through freshly popped kernels. Movie theater concession stands have used this exact combination for years, and it's the real difference between popcorn that just tastes buttery and popcorn that tastes genuinely savory and craveable in a way you can't quite place. 22. Salad dressings with real depth. A tiny pinch whisked into vinaigrette rounds out the sharp edge of vinegar or citrus without needing extra oil, sugar, or honey to balance it. Chinese co-tossed salads and cucumber dishes use this trick to balance acidity in a way that sugar alone can't replicate, since sugar only masks sourness while glutamate actually rebalances it. 21. Gravy and pan sauces that taste restaurant-made. Stir in 1/8 teaspoon right after deglazing your pan before you start thickening the sauce with flour or cornstarch. Because glutamate dissolves instantly in hot liquid, it distributes evenly through the entire sauce instead of clumping in one spot, the way some dry seasoning blends tend to do when added too late. Stay with me, because the next section covers something most people have never even considered: using MSG for your body, not just your food. And number 14 is the one that genuinely surprised me the first time I tried it myself. 20. Tomato-based dishes and even tomato juice. A pinch stirred into tomato sauce, soup, or a plain glass of tomato juice deepens the savory character that tomatoes already carry naturally in their cell structure. Tomatoes happen to be one of the richest natural sources of glutamate on Earth, which is exactly why this particular combination works so seamlessly, and why Italian and Chinese cooking both lean on tomato-heavy bases so heavily. 19. Bland leftovers, revived in minutes. Reheating leftovers with a small pinch of MSG mixed into a splash of water restores flavor that fades after even a single day sitting in the refrigerator. Refrigeration dulls the volatile aromatic compounds in cooked food far faster than most people realize, and glutamate compensates for exactly what reheating alone can never bring back on its own. 18. Sauces and gravies that need thickening and flavor at the same time. When you're building a roux or a cornstarch slurry, whisk in 1/8 teaspoon of MSG alongside it so the flavor develops at the same rate as the texture. That way, you're not stuck adjusting seasoning at the very end after the sauce has already thickened and set into its final consistency. 17. The MSG headache myth and why it never held up. Every major food safety body, including the FDA and the World Health Organization, has reviewed decades of controlled research and found no consistent evidence linking MSG consumption to headaches or the reactions once blamed on it. The entire Chinese restaurant syndrome label traces back to a single 1968 letter to a medical journal, not an actual clinical study, and it stuck around in public consciousness for far longer than the science underneath it ever supported. 16. Eating less without feeling like you're eating less. Umami-rich food triggers satiety signals in the brain faster than food that's simply salty or sweet, according to research on how glutamate interacts with satisfaction and fullness cues. A small amount of MSG stirred into a modest, reasonably sized portion can leave you feeling genuinely full sooner than a much larger, blander plate of the exact same food would. 15. Lower sodium intake for people managing blood pressure. Because MSG contains roughly a third of the sodium found in table salt by weight, swapping part of your salt for MSG is one of the very few flavor-preserving ways to cut sodium that dietitians actually recommend, rather than simply telling patients to eat blander, less satisfying food indefinitely. 14. Bringing appetite back for people who've lost interest in food. Elderly patients and people recovering from illness or surgery often lose much of their sense of taste and smell along the way, and studies conducted on hospital and elder care menus have found that a pinch of MSG measurably increases how much food patients actually finish at each meal. Japanese care facilities have used this for years as a genuinely low-cost way to fight malnutrition among aging patients who otherwise pick at their food. 13. Making the most of food that's starting to turn. Vegetables or meat that are a day past their absolute peak freshness often taste flat and dull well before they actually spoil or go bad. A small pinch of MSG added to the cooking liquid restores enough savoriness that the food actually gets eaten rather than thrown out, which matters far more than it sounds like in households where food waste is taken seriously as a daily habit. 12. Broths for hydration and recovery. A pinch stirred into a savory broth after exercise or illness makes it noticeably easier to drink enough fluid, since plain water and thin, watery soup can feel deeply unsatisfying compared to something with real flavor built into it. Traditional Chinese recovery broths made for new mothers and recovering patients have long included glutamate-rich ingredients like dried scallops and kelp for precisely this reason. 11. Curbing a sugar craving with a savory one instead. A small savory snack seasoned with MSG can interrupt a sugar craving by satisfying an entirely different appetite pathway in the brain. This isn't a weight loss trick so much as a redirection technique, and it tends to work best on cravings driven by boredom or stress rather than genuine physical hunger. 10. Better digestion through more saliva. Umami taste receptors trigger noticeably higher saliva production than salt or sugar do on their own, and saliva carries the digestive enzymes that begin breaking down starches before food even reaches your stomach. A well-seasoned meal that includes MSG digests slightly more easily than the exact same meal without it, simply because your mouth already did more of the initial chemical work. 9. Feeding your garden, not just yourself. Dissolve half a teaspoon of MSG in a full liter of water and use it to water leafy vegetables once every 2 weeks during their growing season. Glutamate breaks down into usable nitrogen compounds once it reaches the soil, and some home gardeners across China have used diluted MSG water for years as an inexpensive nitrogen boost for greens like bok choy and spinach. 8. Speeding up a sluggish compost pile. A full tablespoon of MSG mixed into a compost pile adds a burst of nitrogen that feeds the bacteria responsible for breaking down organic matter efficiently. It's not a substitute for proper compost balance overall, but in small, occasional amounts, it can nudge a stalled pile back into an active breakdown phase within days. 7. Taking the edge off gamey meat. Rubbing a small amount of MSG into lamb, goat, or wild game before cooking doesn't eliminate the gamey smell entirely, but it shifts your perception of it by layering a much stronger savory note directly on top. Households in regions where mutton and goat are dietary staples have used this alongside ginger and vinegar as part of a combined odor-masking approach passed down for generations. 6. Reviving stale breadcrumbs and coatings. Mixing a pinch of MSG into breadcrumbs or batter before frying gives the coating a savory backbone, especially useful when the crumbs themselves have gone slightly stale and lost their own natural flavor over time. This is a common quiet fix in home kitchens that keep a jar of breadcrumbs sitting around in the pantry for weeks at a stretch. 5. An old fishing trick worth knowing. Some anglers mix a pinch of MSG directly into their bait, particularly for catfish and carp, because these bottom-feeding species respond especially strongly to concentrated glutamate signals dispersed through water. It's more of an old folk practice passed between fishermen than a rigorously proven science, but it persists in fishing communities along Chinese rivers and lakes for a reason that keeps getting quietly rediscovered. 4. Curing and preserving meat with more consistent flavor. A small amount of MSG added to a dry cure or brine distributes savoriness evenly throughout the meat as it cures over several days, so the final product tastes consistent all the way from the surface to the center, rather than flavorful only where the seasoning happened to touch first. 3. Keeping leftover broth tasting fresh for longer. A small pinch of MSG added when you store leftover broth in the fridge helps mask the slight flavor dulling that naturally happens over 2 or 3 days of refrigeration, so the broth tastes much closer to day one quality when you finally reheat it later in the week. 2. Building your own low-sodium seasoning blend. Combine 2 parts MSG with 1 part salt and a small pinch of white pepper for an all-purpose seasoning that delivers noticeably more perceived flavor per pinch than salt used alone. This blend is close to what many packaged seasoning salts already contain, minus the anti-caking agents, fillers, and price markup you'd normally be paying for. And now, the final secret. The one that professional Chinese kitchens have used for years and rarely explained to home cooks, saved for last because it ties every other trick on this list together. 1. The universal umami paste. Mix 1 teaspoon of MSG with 1 teaspoon of salt and just enough warm water to form a thin, spreadable paste. Brush it onto meat, tofu, or vegetables right before grilling, roasting, or pan-searing them over high heat. The water carries the glutamate evenly across the entire surface, so it caramelizes directly into the crust as it cooks, instead of sitting as loose, dry crystals that either dissolve away completely or clump unevenly in just one spot. This single paste sits behind the flavor of countless Chinese barbecue stalls and roast meat shops, and it's genuinely the difference between food that simply tastes seasoned and food that tastes engineered, from the first bite to be craveable. That's all 31. A jar of MSG sitting quietly in the back of your pantry has more genuine uses than most people ever give it credit for. Try even 3 of these hacks this week. Tell me which one changed your mind about MSG down in the comments, and subscribe because there's a lot more kitchen science exactly like this still coming.